Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. I will be sharing with you on the GovTech's implementation of the Trusted Center for Census Data. My name is Edwin, and my team implements the Trusted Center for Census Data at the Data Science and Artificial Intelligence Division of GovTech. Okay, so today, what I will be trying to share, what I'll be sharing with you today is what the Trusted Center for Census Data is, and I'll be running through what we seek to achieve with the TCS. In short, that's what we call the Trusted Center. So TCS is one of the 4 trusted centers under the government data architecture. It seeks to enable user-centric data sharing, provide data concierge services, and enable self-help exploitation of the sensor data that we have stored within the Trusted Center for the whole of government users. So when we were implementing the Trusted Center, we had a couple of decisions to make regarding the foundational governance underpinning our approach to how data sharing is done and how governance could be maintained within the GDA itself, or the government data architecture. What this meant was that we had to make a couple of decisions that underpinned how we designed the platform and how the platform leverages on an enterprise identity provider store in order to enable the data request workflow, and also to attest to the identity of the data requesters, as well as which agency and what users are administering the data sets. This is so we have a technical process in place to attest to the identity of both the requester, the data request owner, as well as who the request has passed to. And this in turn allows us to maintain a lineage of the data request. Okay, the couple of other things that I wanted to share today as well would be how we enable user-led discovery and exploitation through our Databricks environment. This is something that we offer within the TCS platform itself. So the data request can go straight from the request to exploitation, and to do so in a self-help manner. Lastly, I think I would leave a short note on privacy preservation in the visualization tool that we have provided for our data requesters. This is something that we wanted to address because typically all data requests come with can I see the most granular data question. So without further ado, I would like to share with you what the TC is within the GDA framework. So what you see here is the GDA framework itself. It comprises of an integrated data management framework leading from data acquisition to data fusion, to data access and distribution, to exploitation, and finally data destruction. So the entire data lifecycle is encapsulated within the GDA framework itself. And TC for Census is essentially one of the 4 trusted centers under this framework. So you will see that the data will flow from the SSOT, which is the single source of truth agency, which sets out the canonical definition for all core data in the sensor domain that comes to the TC for trusted, the TC for sensor data. So GovTech implements the TCS, and SingStat implements in the individual and business TCs, along with SLE for the geospatial TCs. So data users will make requests to the TCs for a clean set of data from the SSOT. And in this entire framework, we seek to support whole of government use cases in order to reduce the amount of time that's required for bilateral data sharing to take place and to enable use cases to be realized faster. So what we sought to do was to enable user-centric data sharing, where you are using data to try and improve on your policy outcomes or operational or your internal agency operations if you came from a WOJ agency, right? Some of the services that we provided, the 2 core services that we provided were concierge services based on the requirements in your data request. These might be things like specific or custom filters, aggregates, geospatial radii for trajectory plotting, stuff like that. In order to do this, we also sought to harmonize the data analytics environment in which both our administrators and the users work. So you may have specific use cases or outsized tasks that require the use of cluster-based notebooks as opposed to a local machine. You will see this for very large data sets. So having this environment is really important in order for the requesters to realize how large of a data set they're dealing with and what they can do with it. There are certain data sets where maybe just 7 days worth of data would take you out of the limits of the local notebook machine or laptop that you're used to. So this is one of the things that we sought to enable directly. We know it's not just about data distribution, but it's also about exploitation. The last thing that we tried to do when we implemented concierge services and the data analytics environment is to allow agency officers who are requesters to grow alongside with our platform. We do this by trying to upskill and uplift them through direct support of their requests, and also through publication of blogs and videos. So some of the typical requester use cases involved are what you see here. They fall into roughly 2 categories. The bulk of the requests will fall into roughly 2 categories. Some examples of these would be if you were trying to use data to do policy making or analysis of outcomes, or whether you want to determine if the data can support your proposed policy implementation. These are all typical requests that come to us. Some examples of policy making analysis would be profiling of carbon emissions on an aggregate basis for sustainability plans and outcomes, and basically national initiatives. Understanding of tenant usage is another use case. We have tenants in, say, JTC estates, or they are occupants of properties that are managed by public agencies, where the landlord, in this case maybe JTC, would need to create policy incentives or look at how they are using, whether they are occupying too much space or using too much power or something like that. So yeah, again, you would use the sensor data in order to try and create policy incentives and sustainability initiatives. A third major category of requests in this group would be urban planning studies and impact assessments. These would take the form of looking at how the consumption data or activity data in a particular region, as measured by the sensor data, can show you or be used as a proxy to determine congestion or activity within certain select areas, and to determine what you want to do as a follow-up to, say, a congestion problem or overconsumption in a certain area. So those are urban planning studies and impact assessments. So the second group here we have that are typical would be requesters who seek to improve service delivery and operations. So one of these would be occupancy detection, in which agencies might use it to look for opportunities to assist members of the public, or else to perform enforcement duties that are under their agency's jurisdiction. The second typical example of this would be to use it to estimate demand in order for them to use it in long-term forecasting and for supply planning. So these are the 2 main groups, but there are other new ways that we have sought to help agencies take advantage of the platform that we offer in order to discover new ways that they can use the data to join or fuse with data sets that belong to them, so that they are not limited by the constraints of their local machine. So as I alluded to earlier, this will be providing the environment in which Databricks will offer you the ability to combine your data set with either demographic or other external data that is owned by the agency, but not necessarily is stored in, say, the TC itself. You can upload the data and then you can combine it to generate other statistics or to do other kinds of modeling. So we have to enable this environment in order for the requesting officers to generate new ways to look at the data itself. So one of the key bottlenecks that we faced was how do we cut the data request flow down from existing processes. Maybe 2 or 3 years back, you might take a couple of weeks or months in order to turn around a bilateral data request. We try to retain governance, but we want to cut the data sharing process down to a fulfillment time of about 7 days. Essentially, that is the turnaround KPI for the TC itself. So data requester itself basically might comprise of a project team of requesters seeking to fulfill their policy analysis, service delivery, enforcement, and audit use cases. They scope the request, they make the request to us, the data controller, the TCS. We would verify and validate the data requests, and then we will clear all of the requests that are for standard track core data. And this is data that doesn't require additional approval from the data owner, which are the SSOTs. So for non-core data or data fields or columns, the request will then flow to the SSOT itself for additional approval. Once the data request has been approved, TCS itself will right limit the data set to minimize the data that's exposed, such that it is sufficient to fulfill the request, but it is not excessive. So there are other things that are in the works for us. We are trying to expand the number of concierge requests we can handle. And what I mean by concierge requests would be specialized filters or custom aggregates, and also to enable system connection setups. And this will be for direct system-to-system connections to the TCS for maybe for enabling certain APIs that are on your system's end, or else for other kinds of data sharing where we do not actually have to transfer the data itself, but more on this in a later installment of the Data Science Connect series that our division runs. It will come, we will share a bit more about that in November. Yeah, so the second key bottleneck that we had was how do we make sure that the data that comes to us from the SSOT was clean? The data owner in this case for the sensor data is actually the SSOT. The SSOT itself provides the TC with data that is collected and derived from sensors. They are also responsible for providing usage guidelines on how to use the data, and they are also responsible for sending the clean data to us. So as the data controller, the TCS will verify and validate the dataset quality itself. We maintain the lineage and change logs of the data that's sent to us. Then we store and distribute what we call or term as the golden copy. And this golden copy is the one that most requesters will rely on for any sort of longitudinal analysis. So the golden copy is important because this golden copy itself should not change with time, or should be any changes to the data set need to be normalized over time, such that when you run analysis over, say, a multi-year analysis, the basis for which you have computed your statistics is consistent. So any other complex requests, we will also assist the requester with. And finally, the data requester itself only needs to make a request using a data sharing form, which then after approval, we will provision the data for them, and they would then be able to produce or consume derivative insights based on the data that's shared and there's right scope for them. So just a note on the current SSOTs we have, they are on the left. With the existing SSOTs, there are PUB, LTA, EMA, and M&E, but there's a number of upcoming ones. So the SSOTs themselves provide the core data that will be used. More importantly, core data refers to data that is used by multiple requester agencies. That is the basis on which the sensor data will be designated, and where the agency will be designated as an SSOT. So we'll look out for upcoming data sets probably towards the end of the year. Okay, so in order to enable the data sharing format, the data sharing request workflow that I've spoken about earlier, we have a simplified data request form that is the standard data sharing form used by the whole of government agencies. So the requested steps have been simplified and encapsulated into one data request form, and this is all the requester needs to fill up. What I'm not saying is that after you fill out the form, you get your data immediately, but it's a simplified manner in which you can make the data request itself. So the steps are basically just preview and select the data set that we require and the required columns. You edit, the requester will just edit for the justification and the purpose under which they are making the data request, and to specify any additional custom requirements, or if they want to make use of, more importantly, if it's a recurring request, whether they want to make use of the Databricks environment to work on the data sets itself. So now that I've shown you the data sharing form itself that we've implemented, I'll try and explain the governance behind this. There are a couple of governance questions that we needed to address. Most importantly, who is making the request, whom should be approving the request, who will ultimately own it, when do we turn it around, how do we isolate data requesters from each other if they are working in Databricks, for example. No, there should not be any commingling of the workspace. How do we transfer authorization with the data lineage itself? So this happens when data owners move on, they leave the agency, or they need to transfer it to someone else. How do we ensure that the process for doing so is accurate? And lastly, how would the TC itself or us know and prove the lineage of both the dataset and the request? So since onward usage is the requester's responsibility under the Public Sector Governance Act, the TCS itself then, in this case, acts as the data controller for WOG agencies. So all of these questions we have to answer by tying it to an attested identity. In this case, we have identified the government directory as the appropriate repository of identification. Our answer to this would then be, has then be to tie all user management to the government's Active Directory, or in this case, essentially what we term as the WJAD is the government's officer directory. This is a centralized directory that will be updated by PST, and this is something that can be tied to Azure AD. And what we have done is implemented based on this IDP store, which is Azure AD, both authentication and authorization. We are relying on authentication through Azure AD because that also means that we do not need to manage user credentials like in the old way you have a user password. There's no such thing here. And the identity of the user is tied to the machine that they will provision from an authorized facility manager or TSM service manager within their agency. So in this manner, we don't need to take care of authentication, but we have an attested identity provider store that does so for us. And the only thing that we will track would be how we do authorization using post-authentication with AAD via the ACL, and to track all user activity using the requisite tokens that we derive from AAD. So now that we have done this, we've eliminated the need to manage user credentials, which some of you might know is a perennial bugbear for public agencies. In this manner, we simply need to configure a trust relationship between our services and AAD itself. That will leave our development team to focus on the business logic, microservices, and additional feature development. So in order to enable such a seamless request process, what we have done is we have tied or built our platform around the IDP store and the data request workflow around the IDP or AAD itself. So critically, we have this thing called the SOE ID, which essentially is your government email address. This is something that you can't change. It's provisioned for you, so you can't really spoof it. And then we have tied this to both the data request workflow as well as the exploitation environment that we have made available to all requesters. We have done this in this manner because AAD itself lives on Azure. So TC itself, if you don't know already, lives on Azure in the government commercial cloud. And because Databricks is a first-class citizen in Azure, we can then tie the Databricks service directly to the data request workflow, such that the user is able to go directly from request to working on the data set itself. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about Databricks is because this environment is what is allowing us to enable user-led data discovery and exploitation. Now, in the Databricks clusters that we use are provisioned for both users and administrators. For administrators, this is TCS ourselves. We make use of the Databricks environment in order to provision and write our ELT jobs to create the golden copy. This golden copy, as I alluded to earlier, was the clean and validated dataset copy that we have that we distribute to the requesting agencies. For the users, this will be shareable workspaces and notebooks that are made available to them on request. And for both admins and users, they will then have access to things like AI/ML libraries, as well as geospatial packages through the use of Databricks notebooks. So users who are on the Databricks workspace, who have requested for it, would then be able to go directly into working on the custom scope dataset or curated dataset for themselves, which are actually implemented as Delta tables. Now, in the environment itself, it allows both admins and users to do follow-on data science work or more complex plots and geospatial plot, both trend analysis and geospatial plotting. The libraries that are made available allow for data wrangling. You can see the libraries listed here. They also include visualization and chart libraries, as well as modeling libraries. So they're all your typical well-known libraries that you can use that are difficult to get into the, if you were in an agency environment individually. But if you are making use of the Databricks environment, this is something that comes as a natural consequence of using the environment. So other things that we have found users doing were self-created visualizations. These included heat maps on a certain sensor variable. So you can see on the left, this is a heat map of a certain distribution on the late evening of a weekday. And finally, I think most importantly, also you can fuse on data that you bring into the workspace from your agency. So a note here would be that because the workspaces are not commingled, and provided your user data has been right classified, you can then use your own data to fuse or join with the scoped sensor data that had been provided to you through your data request. Now, we have done this so that TC can grow alongside with our users, because part of the division's mandate is to help upskill public officers. Sometimes, in many cases, actually, these officers might be limited by resource limits. So, for example, they might only have one notebook or laptop available to them, and depending on what data set it is, they will find that they quickly run out of either memory or storage space in order to work with the data set. So by doing this, we have sought to democratize as much access to resources as possible in order to encourage all officers to self-help with their data. We also do publish tutorials that will explain how to make use or take advantage of multi-threaded functions. or how to make use of Databricks UDFs, how to do geospatial plotting, and so on and so forth, in order to assist the officers with their own analysis and to expand the scope of the data that they're looking at. So lastly, I think I would want to talk a bit about how we deal with privacy protection, because a common question that we have is, show me the units data. What is the units consumption, for example, or what is the Unix exact data field attribute? This is a typical ask. It is always for fine-grained data. So most requesters who make their first initial request will always ask for the most fine-grained data that they can get, but this is not always necessary for their request. So despite some of the precautions that we have in the PSGA, which include things like criminalizing or the abuse of public sector data for your own purposes, like it will criminalize things like creepy things like looking up your spouse or abusing it for profit. But generally, all requesters who make requests to us will find that the administrators would also deny requests for data that's out of scope, data that's not minimized to their requirements, or if the time period for the request had exceeded study needs, or that was actually beyond the existing GDA framework itself. So this might be things like public sector sharing, which is an upcoming thing. It's not enabled yet, but it's something that's in the works. So as the note on how we deal with this for the visualization, because the visualization tool here is something that we use to show what data is contained within the TC itself and to allow users to explore before they make their data request. Something that we would do is, say, for example, for this particular variable, we have aggregated it by postal code to buildings or units or estates. However, if you understand postal codes, you might have one house that is identified by a unique postal code. Because of this, the visualization that we use would have actually suppressed that unit at something like, I think we set the level at 4. Any data that has only 4 unique IDs also, we would suppress and not show it, for example. We also implemented dynamic clustering onto our visualization layer. This is tied to the zoom level of the map itself. So you can see the sensor attributes distribution on a particular estate boundary, say a housing estate or HDB estate or town or planning area. That gives you a very good idea of what the aggregate for that boundary is without having to show you what the exact data rows are. And that allows you to then make your follow-on data requests also, we hope. Yeah, so I come to the end of my talk or discussion, but if you have any queries, you can reach out to us. The TCS site itself, unfortunately, is restricted to the government environment, so you can only reach it if you have a GSIB laptop, but you can always contact us at the aforementioned admin@tcs.gov.sg, or you can ping me directly.